Hello. Hello, welcome to our final meeting. All right, so let me get the names down. And before we begin test three, remember a couple things. One, I want to ask if you have any questions to let me know right now. Otherwise, send me a Canvas message. And let's see here. Also, please remember you have until the night of the 13th. All right, that's just 2 days away. So you just have 2 more days to submit your tests, and it's one submission. All right, so good luck on that. Remember, it constitutes one of at least 13 assignments that are worth 50 points. So don't freak out, especially if you're here and we're going to go through the test. Um, let's see here. Andreas Cisneros, proceed. All right. So I'm going to share the screen. We're going to jump right into it. So you see here, we begin with the age of Andrew Jackson. What you need to remember for the test, okay, is remember, according to primary source accounts, mainly like visitors like Alexei de Tocqueville and other well-to-do men and women, you could find this in a myriad of books, secondary sources. But at any rate, what they contend, right, in the primary sources is that the generation of the 1820s and 1830s experienced a democratizing force socially, politically, and economically. Remember, demos means the people in Greek. So, and recall that we have a republic, not a democracy. And so that our republic supposedly was democratized at this time. So what happened politically to kind of verify that? For one, property requirements for white men, because remember it goes back to English parentage through at least one parent through English common law and or place of birth. But recall that the South was not alone in issuing Jim Crow laws against African Americans. They treated them differently, not of English stock. Native Americans were treated differently. They had some areas, like in the New England colonies and in Pennsylvania, where they flirted with ideas of giving limited citizenship rights to some African Americans. And recall also that, like with the Dutch and the Romans, et cetera, you have levels oftentimes recognized by societies of citizenship. So you could have your basic economic rights protected, then you could have equal protection under the laws, and then you could participate in government. That's a whole next level, right? So at any rate, for property requirements to drop for white men, now an increasing number of white men were enfranchised and allowed to do all three, all those areas of citizenship. And so what do we have to show for it? Well, for one, right, political participation skyrocketed. I don't know how they're able to ascertain these stats at that early of a period as the 1820s and 30s. But if you look at Alan Brinkley's textbook in the back, he has stats on the percentage of eligible voters who showed up on election day to vote for a presidential candidate, and it's pretty impressive. You'll see it up into the high 70s, approximating 80% of eligible voters voting for a presidential candidate. You also had the increase in political rallies and other participatory events that helped the citizenry feel like they were participating in the political process. You also had the nomination. The nomination of candidates was brought about through the convention system, the party convention system. So technically, if you registered with one of the two parties, at that time it was the Democratic Party. They truncated it from Democratic Republican at the time of Jefferson, and the Whig Party that will rise in opposition to them and to Andrew Jackson. If you registered with one of the two parties, you could go to a local party convention and you could nominate any um, citizen for the public office. And they went by popular vote at the conventions. So that was democratized. So was citizenship, as well as the direct election of electors. Remember, we have the elector system to this day. So hence, right, they did not abolish the electoral system. Okay, so keep that in mind for number one. But they did increase the democratization of the process in directly popularly voting for the electors in many of the states. All right, and so of course the Democratic Party jumped on that. Um, so then, at any rate, you also have the fact that supposedly, right, like I'm looking at, for instance, number four, that this was a time of increased economic opportunities, more equality of opportunity. And some of that, of course, was deliberate and some of it just developed organically. The deliberate part, you look at the Charles River Bridge case, the Supreme Court made the decision, right, tried to reemphasize the fact that Home Depot could build its shop anywhere it likes, wherever it's enfranchised by the local government and registered and chartered. But so can Joe Bob with his hardware store. And so that's the case of the Charles River Bridge case, trying to really accentuate the fact that this is a land of opportunity under a capitalist system. Also, Native American lands were for the taking at the end of the War of 1812 up into the early 1820s. And then, of course, you had the Trail of Tears episodes in the 1830s. And so that became another source of advancement up the socioeconomic pyramid to be able to grab Native American lands cheaply and or for free. Squatters' rights were increasingly granted at this time period, whereby someone could claim and prove that he were the rightful owner of a given parcel of land, but if he has not um, cultivated it for a certain number of years, they could give the option. They had several options they could do, but to give at least some of that land access to it by purchase or outright by cession, by deed to the squatter who trespassed technically on that land. Not to mention they had a more direct election of judges at the local levels. And because remember, a judge, right, can make an unpopular decision and not worry about running for reelection. They tried to rectify that. Now, rectify is if something's wrong with that. According to de Tocqueville, there was certainly nothing wrong with that, right? A intellectual who had read his Enlightenment works like Montesquieu's Spirit of the Laws, he knew that there ought to be balanced. There ought to be balance in a republic, and there should be unelected judges who could make unpopular decisions to protect the numerical minority groups, right? As some have euphemistically, joked, they contend that democracy is like two wolves and a lamb voting on what's for dinner. Obviously, the wolves are going to outvote the lamb and eat it. And so, at any rate, you find that in the case in the culture, according to de Tocqueville, in Jacksonian era America. He contends that there was a kind of an xenophobia that was prevalent at that time, as well as feeling of entitlement to do well economically. And so what you have here, right, is it kind of segues into the accusation by some historians and some contemporaries at that time that people like Andrew Jackson and others were typical demagogues, right? That they were manipulators of the people, pushing their emotional and intellectual buttons just to get their vote and to stay in power. And I also would ascribe the term populism to that. That's at least the negative connotation is the connotation under which I have read of that term most often. And so with that, right, I liken it to appealing to your voters' lowest common denominators. Their xenophobia, right? Their fearful hatred and hostility toward anything outside their own realm of familiarity. And so a lot of these poor voters were agricultural still. They were blue collar still and aspiring, of course, to become white collar. Um, but they had an anti-intellectual bent, you could find in the culture, in the writings of the times. They had an anti-urban and banker and merchant and like bourgeois bent, even though ironically they're trying to join the bourgeois class, right? um, many contradictions in popular sentiment throughout any history. And then also an anti-foreign. When I say foreign, right, you think of like kind of post-civil rights historiography, Marxist historiography of winners and losers, and the winners are the villains. You find that, right, a term often found called WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, that anyone or anything outside of the WASP demographic was discriminated against at this time period. So at any rate, if you were running for office, what was the best way to do so, right, was to basically run a log cabin campaign to illustrate to the people that you did not put on airs. You were not the recipient ever of favoritism, nepotism, privilege, but that you come from good blue collar roots, and you earned through the sweat of your brow, right, through the shrewdness of your intellect, that in the shrewdness of your decisions, that you earned your rise, right, as a quote self-made man. And so you had candidates trying to outdo one another, contending, no, I was born in a log cabin in Kentucky and fought off grizzly bears and Native American attacks, and worked three jobs, farming and land surveying. And in the case with so many presidents, including Andrew Jackson, I apprenticed myself to a local lawyer and slowly became one. Because remember, they didn't have an international or national bar, uh, uh, a uniform bar exam, much less a law degree required, etc. So you did it kind of like an artisan would. And so that was open technically to ambitious and patient people. And so, Andrew Jackson, as Richard Hofstadter, an historian, states, uh, offices fell to him like a ripe fruit, just falling into his hands because he fit that demographic, that image very well. He continued to have the proverbial Scots Irish temperament. Remember the Scots Irish, you could find evidence during the War for Independence in a previous generation of them being considered scum. Now, right, it was cool to be considered Scots Irish, to be from that poor, hard scrabble demographic, and having fought and earned your way up the socioeconomic chain. That Andrew Jackson was orphaned by the time he was 14, just further enhanced that type of self-made man image. So uh, Alexis de Tocqueville, he was concerned about that. He was concerned about that. He thought that society was becoming too democratized. Um, and he kind of got a kick out of the fact that, he contends, which is very arguable, and Edward Pesson, the historian Pesson, disagrees with this, looking at stats. Um, but de Tocqueville contended that there was a general, relative to other societies like in Europe, that there was a general equality of opportunity and general equality even of condition in America, that a lot of Americans were of the same kind of humble socioeconomic spot on the pyramid, and that most of them were expecting to rise up at least a couple rungs up the ladder before they die. And so it's an interesting time period. But again, the whole idea of populism and so forth, I'm going to move on to number 6 with the Trail of Tears. So what has been one body that's been pretty historically beholden to the voters as a popularly elected office? One would be the city council, and another one, just one level higher, or perhaps two after the county, is the state level, the state assemblyman. And so the assemblymen, right, allegedly feeling beholden to their voters, they knew their voters coveted Native American lands. And it's very ironic when you read a book on the Trail of Tears, right, with the Cherokee and Choctaw and other tribes. What were they called? They were called civilized tribes because they've gone out of their way to make steps toward assimilation. And remember, assimilation is you somewhat drop your own customs, cultures, even worldview, normative behavior and ethics, and you embrace that of someone else. And so they largely assimilated in many ways, became cash crop farmers, sent their kids to Christian schools, and became Christian. Um, at Ashota, amongst the Cherokee, they developed a Republican form of government, of checks and balances, et cetera, constitutional, that was modeled after our nation's republic. And so, but it was to no avail, right? And so the state assemblyman issued eminent domain laws, contending that for the betterment of the entire state, it was mandatory that the Native Americans sell their tribal lands back to the state so they could offer it great deals to their citizens, hence their voters, right? A popular term used by Andrew Jackson at this time was popular mandate, right? Like mandato in Spanish, right? Which means to demand. There was a popular demand, he said, for certain things. And it was some would say it might be circular reasoning, et cetera, but whereby the voters, those who running for office, sometimes they do deliberately stay very vague in their platform because they don't want to alienate any demographics, right? They want to win over as many demographics as possible. They don't want to step on toes and taking too strong of a stance on a certain issue. Um, but the people, in many ways, will let it be known what they're demanding. And one way to do it is to look at candidates who do have the audacity to have a clear-cut um, platform. And you see overwhelmingly oftentimes them winning or losing, right? And especially by the proportion thereof, how popular those issues chosen by that candidate are to the voters. So there are ways by which Andrew Jackson said that you could easily infer what the people are demanding. And he acted as if it were just gospel importance that and truth that you adhere to the popular demand. And of course, right, you see in mass psychology and sociology, you could see the degree to which people are very malleable, right? What was the famous test where people were given a test and they had peers around them and the peers were setting them up and they didn't know it, and they would begin answering, their peers would begin answering the correct answers, and then they would begin to veer away from obviously correct answers, giving false answers. And the person being tested, unbeknownst to him or her, right? You could see, according to the results of this test, supposedly, the internal conflict going on inside the person, right? Wanting to go along with his or her peers, but feeling very strongly also simultaneously that they're wrong on that given answer. And oftentimes, according to those test results, the people do give in and veer away from what they inherently know to be true and go along with the others in choosing the false answers. I find that kind of stuff to be fascinating. So at any rate, so much for treating the will of the majority plus one as gospel truth. I think at this time period, had they done a referendum on slavery, that it would have passed in many of the states. A referendum on Jim Crow laws against African Americans, that would have passed in many of the states. The disenfranchisement of women still at this time in many of the states seem to have been popularly embraced. So across gender lines as well. So so at any rate, it's something to think about, right? So what some historians do is they use the Jacksonian period as kind of a moral lesson of showing you how popular majoritarian democracy can become dangerous. That it's not inherently um, perfect by any stretch of the imagination or inerrant. Okay, and so the Supreme Court did side with the federal government because it became a state's power versus federal power and authority in the Worcester case. under William Wirt as the attorney representing the Cherokee. And the Supreme Court sided with the Cherokee, contending, right, that if a federal law cedes land by way of a treaty to Native American tribes, that treaty prevails over a state legislator and a state law mandating that they sell that same land. But interestingly, right, Andrew Jackson contended that he had a popular mandate from the people, that he was going to defy the Supreme Court decision and force the Cherokee, Choctaw, and other tribes to sell their lands and abide by the state laws, and to be almost forcefully militarily removed into present day Arkansas and Oklahoma, uh, considered Indian territory at that time. And he did use paternalistic rhetoric as well. He contended, right, that not only he had a popular mandate, that that's what the people of Georgia and the Carolinas, et cetera, wanted, so hence it ought to prevail, but also, right, that the Native Americans were unassimilable. They were unable and unwilling to fully integrate into WASP America. And so hence, insofar as that they were allegedly unable and unwilling to assimilate, they were like oil and water with WASP America, and conflict would become inevitable. So starting with a shaky premise, using arguably the slippery slope fallacy of against logic, that's the rationale basically that he came up with, and forcing the native tribes to be removed. So it's a very sad, um, you know, a warning, oftentimes used in history books as a cautionary tale about democracy. Okay. Remember, a lot of these, as you see here coming up, a lot of these are straight out of your argumentative assignments. So don't forget to, take a look over them from the time of from the assignment on Andrew Jackson through the end of the semester, the last 3 or 4 topics. So at any rate, you'll find in there, right, that there is evidence for overt racism uh, and discrimination in the primary sources of the mid to late 1800s. No bones about it. I wouldn't even know where to begin as far as trying to, to try to support that. But I try to in the argumentative assignment. So maybe take a look at that. So that absolutely is the case, that it was very overt. They didn't even try to hide it. It's also true that there was like a vicious cycle, according to this handout, right? By which others, quote, others, right? Like in a psychology and sociology term, people that you don't have to empathize with and walk in their shoes because you have marginalized or even dehumanized them into an other category. So whereby others, right, are stigmatized, right? They're stereotyped, um, and they're marginalized. They're kind of kicked to the corner, not given the same opportunities. And what they have is coveted. In particular, we're talking about the Hispanics, and then it thereby they would justify war. So we went over the loss of Texas. We went over the loss of the far west by way of the Mexican American War of 1846 to 48. We have information not only in the handout, but also in a previous lecture that I've done. And so let's see here. According to court history, what we oftentimes learned as children, the April 6th law banning further Anglo-American immigration into eastern Mexican Texas under Austin's territory as the governor, if you will, right, in that area, supposed to be in charge of the Anglos and others that lived in that area. It became very quickly known as being defiant. Remember, there was a guy named Mier y Terán, and Mier y Terán, he came up there and he wrote a report on behalf of the Mexican government, and basically it was very prescient, right, like telling of the future, and saying that these Anglo Americans are defiant. They don't abide by Mexican laws and expectations. They're very haughty, right, very arrogant and defiant of laws being applied to them, and that they greatly outnumber the Tejanos, the ethnic Hispanic Texans. And he says, if we don't do something about this and do something about it quickly, we're going to lose this province to these defiant Anglos, Americanos. So at any rate, the April 6th law was the result. 2 to 3 presidents, right? Bustamante and Gomez Farias, at least, both supported this, despite being on the opposite sides of the spectrum. And they said no more gringo immigration. Any of those who are defying the laws can be deported, and they must pay their taxes. And then you have eventually Santa Anna's quote revolution against Gomez Farias around 1833, 34. And with that constitution, it was exceedingly conservative. You look at the fact that he could shut down the Mexican Congress at will. He could handpick the governors of the states as his department leaders now, rather than have them right in a federal system according to the 1824 Constitution, whereby the governors were popularly elected, as were the state assemblymen. And so it really did curtail representative democracy, local independence or autonomy. It did so. But according to Chicano historians, right, that was just a pretext. That was a convenient excuse. But of course, to American court history, that and the April 6th law constituted allegedly justifiable reasons for the Anglos, primarily Anglos in eastern Texas, to rebel and to secede from Mexico. And as you probably recall, from 1836 to 1845, Texas will be a quote Lone Star state, its own republic, before it is annexed by the United States. And Mexico had warned the American government not to ever try to annex the state of Texas. They planned to get it back, the Mexican government, that is. And so when they did, that arguably was provocative of a fight. And then you add the fact that Polk comes in after Tyler begins this. President John Tyler was a lame duck president and begins this process, encouraging it for annexation. And then Polk comes in and makes no bones about it. He wants California. He wants Mexican California. And so he runs as a one-term president, wins as a dark horse. And to what extent is that emblematic of the fact that the Americans elected this guy into office, as well as many others like Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri and others who were very ardently imperialistic. They coveted Hispanic lands, wanted them, and made no apologies for it when they ran for office. So number 10, right, that is true in that you'll find in the argumentative assignment that the writer puts blame on the people themselves of that generation for democratically elected leaders who they fully knew would engage in imperialistic endeavors against Mexico. And so remember, that's in the argumentative assignment. That does not mean that it's the gospel truth. That kind of exonerates, lets off the hook the leaders like James K. Polk and Benton and others who were clearly imperialist and used their positions to bring about such types of activity. And so that's very argumentative on number 10. Okay, it's very subjective, but that is the case technically in the argumentative assignment. That's all that's being asked on number 10. All right, so we've done 11 as well. We've done 8 and 9. Then going on to Turner's thesis, right, with the West. As you probably recall, Turner's romantic thesis was that the West, by virtue of its conditions, right, and the opportunities afforded there, renewed American meritocracy and made American meritocracy become cemented as Americana, of what America stands for, of what our identity constitutes, etc. Right? So with this idea, is he contends in particular that the West was a great leveler, right? It put everyone on an equal level playing field relatively. That the dangers there were inherently there, whether you were rich, poor, whatever your last name was, whatever your ethnic background was, your age, etc. That you could just as easily be killed. I think of like Candy Moulton and other old school historians who get into facts about people being gored by buffalo and cattle herds, people dying, drowning in the Platte River and Columbia and Snake Rivers, people getting typhoid fever and a myriad of diseases across the Oregon Trail, being attacked or extorted by the Crow and the Blackfeet and other tribes. Thinking in particular the Comanche and Apache along the Santa Fe Trail. And so, he says that the dangers were equally inherently there for everyone, but so were the opportunities. If you were quick enough, in particular, opportunities that were like entrepreneurial uh, in origin, starting a business of some sort. So some people use the term mining the miners, right? Finding out something that the miners would want uh, in a um, in a given area, like the gold rush, mother lode, and whether it be food, lodging, entertainment, uh, um, tools, etc., right? And providing that for them for profit. So there is evidence of people doing such. There is evidence in 1848, according to the Spanish newspapers in California, that a lot of gold and wealth from that gold was extracted at the very superficial level by people who just simply beat others to the punch, getting there firstly. And no capital was hardly necessary, like money to play with to start with. No expertise in mining was necessarily needed in 1848. However, right, what would not be mentioned in support of Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis? Any type of ethnic discrimination, right, namely against Hispanics and Asians, like you see in the foreign miners' taxes. That clearly would be conveniently omitted by an historian who is adhering to Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis, right? Which, remember, states that the West renewed American meritocracy, that everyone can rise or fall according to his or her own merit, what he or she earns or deserves and works for. So against his thesis, you not only have ethnic discrimination that clearly flies in the face of that thesis, you not only have theories of causation being challenged about frontiers developing democratic societies, but you also have the Marxist contention that the West was no different from anywhere else and that it took money to make money, and that big money, big capital, corporations, well connected corporations in particular with political capital connections to be subsidized by the government and by other big, helped out by other big corporations, had a huge leg up on the common people. All right. So all that would be evidence for such. Let's see here. Then moving on number 16, we begin to the alleged causes of the Civil War. So remember, right, the court history of the Civil War, we've already gone through this, was that it was a crusade to finish what the founding fathers had begun and making this a country that was enlightened in its foundations, right? Predicated on assumptions like all men are created equal, right? Like with the famous Gettysburg Address by Lincoln, of, by, and for the people, etc. And so it starts off with a contention that there was a special, an anomalous, an out of the ordinary generation that arose in the 1830s that was increasingly idealistic. They wanted to change and improve man and change and improve the world, right? And so as some of the foundations for this are seen culturally in the Second Great Awakening, which was very optimistic about human nature and human capabilities, and also the Transcendentalist movement, right, that stressed that everyone ought to transcend his or her animal existence, low on Maslow's hierarchy of needs of just basic food and shelter, and try to, tend to self-cultivation and enlightenment, etc., right? So all those are used as examples of alleged antebellum idealism. Remember, they wanted to preserve the nuclear family. They were concerned about an increasingly bourgeois industrializing society. Those are all true, right? They engaged in prison reform, asylum reform, public education reform, religious reforms like the Sabbath movement, temperance reform against alcoholism, of course, abolitionism against slavery, right? So all those are true. And let's see here. And the radical Republicans, they stress in court history especially that the radical Republicans were exceedingly idealistic. What I mean by that is that they were so bent on improving the world, say these types of historians, that they didn't care about the practical methods that had to be set aside or utilized, or what the consequences of their stance would include, but they were just so bent on ending slavery that they didn't care. So they were certainly not the conciliatory arm of the Republican Party. They were the radical left wing of the Republican Party, right? Remember, one example that I have given is that they didn't worry about constitutional issues of having a federal constitutional republic in which the Constitution does not state explicitly anywhere in the first three articles or after that the federal government has the power to end slavery in any of the states. But that didn't stop them. Abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison and others, Joshua Giddings in politics, Salmon Chase, etc. So at any rate, yeah, you have that. Uh, and however, revisionists contend that the radical Republicans, like they sometimes adhere to the Dunning thesis written by William Dunning, where they said that the radical Republicans were not as altruistic humanitarians as we think they are, but that they were namely wanted to divide and conquer the white South, and after the end of the war, punish the white South. So what they did for African Americans, that they supposedly did not do it for the right reasons, with the right motives, okay? And that gets us into revisionist history. And revisionist history, right, shows evidence of racism in the North as well as in the South, an increasing number of you see here, like with number 25, and an increasing sense of desperation on behalf of the federal government, and perhaps wanting to manipulatively divide and conquer the South by freeing their slaves and then using such slaves, the male slaves, to fight for them, to help them win the Civil War. So they look for ulterior motives as such, right? They contend also that they oftentimes believe in the faction thesis, that the North opposed slavery not for the right reasons, and the South supported slavery for similar reasons that were largely economic and political, of self-interest nature. So the faction thesis, right, is that if you were a slave owner, you want as many fellow slave owners in Congress as possible, because what's for your best interest will be for theirs as well. Likewise, if you're a bourgeois mill or factory owner, and you want as many mill and factory owners and workers voting on the western side of the country as possible, because that they will allegedly vote the same way you do, because again, what's in your best interest will be in their best interest as well. So revisionist history is very cynical against the idea of the Civil War being a moral crusade on behalf of the North. All right. And then, of course, revisionists show some awful things about Abraham Lincoln, such as his alleged, the cases of him contending that he was against the social and political equality of Black and white Americans, the fact that he dragged his feet, took his sweet time in declaring the slaves free. And even when he did, he only declared the slaves of rebels free. And he allowed, like those in Kentucky, to keep their slaves as long as they fought with and for him instead of the Confederacy. So those are all to be considered. And remember, court history contends that Abraham Lincoln, he experienced character development, that he had begun indifferent to slavery, a typical selfish kid growing up, but that he had a few epiphanies. He had a roommate in Joshua Giddings, and had experiences that slowly had him coming around and becoming something that approximated an abolitionist, arguably, by the time he died. All right. And remember also, Abraham Lincoln did put some radicals in his cabinet, like William Seward. All right. So most of these in the textbook can be found in chapters 13 and 14, but numbers 27 through 30, I'm going to let you look those up. All right. Like I said, most of them can be found in chapters 13 and 14. So go ahead and take a look at those yourselves. Okay. I want to at least keep something just in your hands rather than giving, um, the data for all the questions. So remember Dunning's thesis, right, is that the North did what it did for African Americans for all the wrong reasons. Okay. It would not hence stress abolitionist sentiment in the North. African American agency, remember that they were moral agents, post civil rights movement and historiography, that they did things that mattered, that helped turn events in a certain direction. When you look at that, right, they contend that they were very proactive in participating politically and trying to help determine their own fate. So they, before the Civil War, they oftentimes met in churches and with formal or informal Black preachers. Um, they were able to congregate in things like Congo Square in New Orleans and other areas to a limited extent. The freedmen are those who were free African Americans, like in Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans. Um, they were able to develop schools of their own, businesses of their own, educate one another, go to their own churches, or in segregated fashion, go to white churches. But when the war began, right, very quickly they established Liberty and Lincoln Leagues, these informal grassroots associations that sometimes started out just simply as one literate African American reading a local newspaper to a crowd of people at a train depot and informing them of their rights and teaching them about the 13th through 15th Amendments in the Civil Rights Act of 1866, et cetera, et cetera. So they did that. There tends to be, according to historian Eric Foner, somewhat of a caste system amongst the African Americans that had begun, and it largely, for lack of a more sophisticated way of interpreting it, when I read Foner's works on this, it just seemed like those who had reason to believe have an enhanced self confidence, right? Those who had been free for most of their lives. And by the way, a lot of those who had been free, numerically, statistically, oftentimes had a white father who made a deal of some sort with the Black mother of his child or children that they would eventually become emancipated. And so a lot of the initial leaders who were elected um, during Reconstruction to office were biracial, lighter skinned, had never been slaves themselves, had been business owners and others in the Black community before, had served in the armed forces and fought in the Civil War, were preachers accustomed to having their flock come to them for aid and comfort and for leadership, right? But by 1868, Eric Foner contends there seems to have experienced a shift whereby you have an increasing number, like Robert Smalls and others, and Robert Elliott, of freedmen, of people who had actually been, slaves. Many of them plantation slaves. Many of them who had never had the opportunity to become literate, and had to have a scribe read and write for them in Congress, etc. So it's a fascinating topic, um, but all that is the case, right? Their participation was impressively high. Um, Foner in one of his books contends that up to 90%, 90, of eligible voters of African American descent from 1867 to 1868 were going to the polls and voting on election days. That's incredible, especially when at least about a fifth of them were either threatened or physically attacked by angry white Southerners. So all that seems to be the case. Remember, the 13th Amendment formally abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment defined citizenship and nationalized it across all the states, right? Radical or congressional reconstruction, that did include, to a limited degree, at least flirting with land redistribution, education for freedmen. Remember, according to Foner again, you're talking about 2 to 5% of African Americans in the South had been literate. By the end of the Reconstruction era, he thinks up to 40% had become literate by way of the freedmen schools and other public schools when African Americans were allowed to participate in government and served. What's interesting in some of the counties in Mississippi, as well as throughout much of the state of South Carolina, African Americans ended up outnumbering as citizens the white counterparts of theirs in their own state. And it showed for a brief period of time in electing a majority of assemblymen and other elected African Americans into office. All right. They certainly did not want pardons for ex-Confederate leaders, because remember, according to Dunning's thesis, there was largely a punitive, a vindictive element to the radical Republicans in wanting to punish the white South and waving the bloody shirt, as they say, saying, if you had fought against us, then you were a traitor and you're not worthy of participating at this time at the major levers of power. And I think of Thaddeus Stevens as an example of both, of idealism and a bit of a punitive element to it. What was a common explanation for the failure of Reconstruction? All of those were mentioned. Diminished Northern interest, Compromise of 1877, ex-Confederate leaders under Article 2 of the 14th Amendment who had sworn to defend the Constitution and then subsequently had joined the rebellion, were deprived of their citizenship rights, disenfranchised for 2 years. Well, those 2 years passed, right? And then the press spoke about African-American misrule, Negro misrule at the time. So all those were some of the reasons in the popular narrative for explaining why Reconstruction failed for the African-Americans. Because as you know, by 1877, the South is going to revert to the Jim Crow laws. Okay. So are there any questions? All right. Can I get any thumbs up? You guys with me? You feel okay on this?
I'm feeling pretty good.
Thank you. Thank you, hon. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Of course.
Karen, Andrea. Perfect. Perfect. You guys will do well. I know you will. And remember, this is just one of at least 13 assignments that are worth 50 points. So don't freak out about it. But you do have one submission. All right. So look up those textbook ones, okay? And please don't forget that it's just the day after tomorrow, midnight of the 13th to the 14th. By that time, I need you to have turned in everything. And please remember, if I've already gone through a list of assignments, and I can't recall exactly, I want to say that I'm at least on the War of 1812 as far as correcting them. If it's anything prior to that, I don't know to go back to that assignment unless you let me know. If you want to, do a zero submission for partial credit. And yes, of course, partial credit in fairness to those who did it on time. But something definitely constitutes, something better than nothing. So, but I need to know to go for your specific name and assignment on a list of assignments that I've already gone through. So please Canvas message me with that. Okay. Yes, Arena, please.
I just want to make sure that I wasn't missed, because like my assignments starting from March 21st, they are not graded. So
Yes.
you just didn't work on them, or maybe you missed me. I just want to make sure that I'm on track.
No, you're fine, Arena. I'm sorry.
Okay.
I just
No
haven't
worries.
gotten to them yet. Yeah, I mean it's that simple, and I apologize.
No need to
Yeah, you're
apologize.
fine.
Just I want to make sure that you see that I submitted it.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So yeah, if you submitted it, it should be there and it should be fine. I'll play catch up. The last couple of days, if you thought I was behind with you guys, I was even further behind in my second class at this school. And so the last couple of days I've been doing nothing but their assignments. So I'm going back to yours today. All right. So thank you for your patience. And
I
please
do have a
remember, as I put in the announcement, you're very welcome, Irina. Thank you. I really appreciate your participation in these Zoom meetings, even if you don't say anything. I appreciate you being here and listening. And I also want to remind you, make sure, okay, again, the night of the 13th, and be sure that you finish the quizzes that I have up. I don't have all of them, and the ones that I didn't post, you get automatic 100%, 25 points on. All right, but the ones that I did, you'll be responsible for. All right, thank you, Irina. I appreciate your
Can I
feedback.
ask a question?
Yes, of course, Karen.
I read the textbook, but maybe I just didn't find the answer. Number 27 about the free soil party.
Yes.
Um, I guess I was just a little confused on that because I'm not sure.
Let's see
I know
here.
it's when you told us to look up, but I was trying to find it.
No, and that I feel better with, to be honest, um, it being you, Ms. Nichols, because I know that you're a serious, vigilant student. So if you were unable to find it, then that there might be something behind the question itself not being adequately clear, etc. I'm going to cheat, even though I'm pretty sure it's in chapter 13. I'm going to look in the index at the back, right straight for the term. So let's see here.
It may be there, but I just was having trouble deciding.
No,
what-
it's okay. It's okay. I understand. Let's see here. 335, 357. So I have a few pages here. In mine, in my edition, it says the first page is 335. All right. And the question is, the textbook contends that the Free Soil Party's formation signaled the inability of the existing parties to contain, I think, political passions created by the slavery issue.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Okay, well, I'm looking at it verbatim. I'm looking for a verbatim, corroboration, and I'm not finding it yet on this first page. However, I feel pretty safe and just simply contending to you. I know this is not the academic way of doing this, but that was meant to be true.
Okay.
That particular one, okay?
hmm
Yeah, I know it's somewhere, and just from my knowledge of the Free Soil Party, I definitely think I intended that to be true, and I like to think that that very phrase ought to be discoverable, for lack of a better adjective, in the text. Very likely, again,
Okay.
in chapter 3. So when I looked it up in the index, it gave me at least 3 pages. So I would begin by doing that, looking up the exact pages and reading verbatim, okay? Because I usually don't like to do that. Not only give an answer, but I also like to put the question in summation form, right? So you're not going to overtly find that exact phrase, but just if you imbibe what you're reading, you'll understand that phrase and know if it's true or false. In this case, I'm pretty sure on one of those pages, I pretty much borrowed that phrase as well. So I think you can, if you look further into it, see that it was meant to be true.
Thank you.
No problem. All right. So anyone else? All right, so please remember, okay, the 13th, the night of the 13th to the 14th at midnight, please be sure that you've submitted everything. And if you have anything that is, exceptionally connected to your case, not to be dramatic here, but if you have already emailed me and told me that you suffered from the COVID virus, I know I've had some dramatic cases in some of the messages. Remind me, please send me one more Canvas message to remind me of anything, any variable that I need to consider in putting together your final grade. And please remember, the wiggle room I give myself is small. All right, is very small. Primarily, you earn your own grade. Okay, I want to make that clear. But if you are relatively close, so like for instance, with like an 80-point differential grading rubric, right? From the 870s to 950, constituting an A. If you're in the high 850s or in the 860s, so you're just within about 10 points of the next grade, and you have a special circumstance, something I need to remember, no problem, Karen. Let me know. Okay, let me know, and I reserve the right to bump you up. All right. But of course, if you're right in the middle of the spectrum, at the bottom of the spectrum, I don't go that far. All right. So just in case, just let me know, remind me. So thank you, Karen. Thank you, everyone, for your patience this semester. And I appreciate you, and I wish you well. I wish I could have met you. All right. So take care. I'm going to go ahead and call it a day, technically call it a semester. Yes, Chrissy.
Okay, I noticed that the History 101 test number 3, the assignment you gave us on the last module, questions 31 through 35 are different from what you were showing us on your shared screen. Is it going to be the same as are we going to have to answer all those questions the same as the one that you showed on the module, or is it going to
Yes,
be
that's a great
true or false?
question. No, it's, I apologize. What I was going to do is give you questions on Reconstruction. I mean, I ended up doing it anyway, but I was going to add those questions. And so I apologize. What we covered today, what's on the actual quiz, is what you'll have. So I'll tell you what I'll do. I know it's late now, but I will switch the test. Okay. Whenever I get
Okay.
done with this meeting, I'll switch test 3 to the one that you're seeing on this video, because the one that you're
Okay,
seeing on
thank
this
you.
video, numbers 31 to 35. Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you for the clarification.
You're welcome. Sorry about that.
No, it's no problem.
All right. Anyone else? All right. Well, thank you. You take care of yourselves, okay? And we'll go ahead and call it a semester. I
Thank
appreciate it.
you.
You're welcome. Thank you, Bridget.